What do you
Seattle's
think of
late
this
summer
one? It's
evenings
quite
had a way
striking,
of
isn't it?
weaving mystery into the air. The sky above the city was painted in strokes of gold and violet, the last light of day folding itself into the restless hum of nightlife. On Pike Street, the facade of the newly opened Artemis Gallery glowed with understated elegance. The tall glass panels reflected the street lamps, while inside warm light bathed polished marble floors and minimalist walls hung with modern art pieces. It was the event where the elite gathered not for art alone, but for power, reputation, and quiet deals whispered over champagne. Among them was James Hall. He stood near the entrance, his posture immaculate, his presence impossible to overlook. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that spoke of quiet authority, James exuded the kind of wealth and influence that drew glances without effort. Yet something in his expression, an air of detachment, almost loneliness, set him apart from the surrounding chatter. At 40, James had built an empire in technology, a name synonymous with innovation and dominance. But those who looked closer noticed the weight behind his sharp blue eyes. His wife had died 3 years ago, and though society still paraded him as one of America's most eligible men, James had long stopped caring for such titles. Tonight, he hadn't come for art. He had come because appearances mattered. Across the room, Sofia Carter slipped quietly into the gallery, her entrance far less noticed, but no less significant. She wasn't dressed like the patrons around her in couture gowns and glittering jewelry. Instead, she wore a simple black dress that hugged her tall, slender frame, with elegance and silver hoop earrings that caught the light when she turned her head. Her natural curls framed her face, giving her beauty a bold authenticity that outshone the calculated perfection of others in the room. Sofia wasn't here to admire brushstrokes or mingle for connections. She was here with a notebook tucked discreetly in her purse, her eyes sharp scanning. She was a freelance journalist who had built her name on stories others were too afraid to write. Sofia relentlessly sought corporate corruption, systemic injustice, and buried truths. And tonight, her instincts had guided her here, because James Hall was attending. She had been investigating Hall Group for weeks, rumors of hidden partnerships, questionable acquisitions, whispers of something darker beneath the polished surface of one of America's most powerful tech companies. And while James was notoriously private, tonight was her chance to observe him in his element. Their paths crossed by accident or fate. James had turned away from an investor droning on about stock projections, his attention drifting toward the art piece at the center of the room, a canvas painted in bold strokes of crimson and black, a chaotic storm frozen in time. The crowd around it murmured vague interpretations, but James saw something raw, something unsettling. And then he noticed her. Sofia stood a few feet away, her gaze fixed on the same painting. Unlike the others, her expression wasn't one of polite interest. It was intense and thoughtful, as if she were dissecting the piece with clarity that others lacked. For a moment, James studied her, the elegance in her stillness, the way her dark eyes shimmered with intellect and quiet defiance. Sofia, sensing the weight of someone's gaze, turned, and their eyes locked. It wasn't the lingering look of strangers, curious about each other at a social gathering. It was sharper charged, as if some invisible current had bridged the distance between them. James inclined his head politely, the practiced gesture of a man used to polite society. Sofia, however, didn't smile. Her lips curved into something closer to challenge than courtesy. "You see chaos," she said suddenly, her voice low, smooth, and carrying a hint of steel. "But maybe it's not chaos. It could be the truth people don't want to face." James blinked, surprised. Few people dared to offer him unsolicited interpretations of art or anything else. And what truth is? That he asked, his voice a deep baritone that carried authority without effort. "That destruction doesn't come out of nowhere," Sofia replied, her gaze unflinching. It builds slowly under the surface until it erupts. This painting doesn't just show a storm. It shows the aftermath of secrets ignored for too long. Something in her words unsettled him, though he masked it behind a faint smile. He wondered if she knew, if she had come tonight for more than art. Before he could respond, a curator approached, gushing about donations and potential collaborations, pulling James's attention away. Sofia used the distraction to slip back into the crowd, her notebook already out pen, scratching swiftly. But James was not a man easily distracted. His eyes followed her curiosity sparked. Who was she to speak with such conviction? To look at him not with awe or envy, but as though she were already peeling back layers he had carefully kept hidden. The evening continued with glasses clinking, polite laughter rising and fading, and deals sealed behind closed smiles. Yet James found himself searching for her again and again in the crowd. Sofia, meanwhile, was working. She noticed how executives clustered tightly around James, the hushed tones, the guarded glances. She had trained herself to read body language, to see the gaps between words. And here the gaps were louder than the conversations themselves. Her pulse quickened when she overheard two men whispering near the champagne table. The merger in San Francisco isn't supposed to come out yet. Keep your voice down. Hall can't afford exposure, not now. The words were fleeting, cut off as soon as they noticed her nearby, but they lodged in Sofia's mind like splinters. She looked toward James again. He stood surrounded by influence and wealth, yet there was a tension in his shoulders, a shadow behind his controlled demeanor. And suddenly Sofia understood James Hall wasn't simply a billionaire enjoying art. He carried a secret big enough to crack the foundation beneath him. Their eyes met again across the gallery, as if he could sense her realization. For the first time in years, James felt vulnerable, not because of investors or rivals, but because of the gaze of one woman who seemed dangerously close to seeing through him. Sofia closed her notebook, slipped it back into her purse, and turned toward the exit. She hadn't planned to confront him tonight, not yet, but she knew with certainty that this was only the beginning. And James knew, with the same certainty, that their paths were now intertwined, whether by chance or destiny, by attraction or threat. As the night drew to a close, the storm hinted at in the painting seemed to come alive in the air around them. A storm that neither of them could escape. The first article appeared quietly tucked into the weekend edition of a respected online journal. Its headline was measured, not sensationalist, but the words cut sharply. Behind the facade, questions surrounding Hall Group's expansion. The byline carried a name James Hall had not yet forgotten: Sofia Carter. At first, James dismissed it. Journalists had probed his empire before, always seeking cracks in the marble of Hall Group's dominance. Yet, as he read further, his jaw tightened. Sofia's writing wasn't speculative fluff. It was deliberate, precise. She had traced subsidiaries, buried 3 layers deep, uncovered land acquisitions in small Midwestern towns, and raised questions about their impact on local communities. Nothing illegal. Nothing overtly damning, but there was a rhythm to her prose, a sense of direction, as if she were drawing a map toward a larger truth. For the first time in years, James felt cornered. The morning after the article's release, James sat in his penthouse office overlooking the Seattle skyline. The room was austere glass walls, steel dark mahogany, but the storm inside him had little to do with design. He tossed the printed article onto his desk. The bold letters of Sofia's name glared up at him. "Get me everything on her," James ordered, his voice clipped. His head of security hesitated. "She's a journalist, sir. Independent. No corporate ties we can leverage." James's stare hardened. Then dig deeper. Everyone has a weakness. But even as he spoke, irritation twisted with something else. The memory of her eyes at the gallery, sharp, defiant, unafraid, lingered like an echo. He was angry, yes. But beneath the anger was an unsettling respect. This woman wasn't just writing, she was challenging him. In a small apartment in Brooklyn, far removed from James's world of glass towers, Sofia hunched over her desk. Stacks of notes, highlighted documents, and open tabs cluttered her space. The city hummed outside her window, but her focus was unshakable. She knew the risk of pursuing Hall Group. Friends had warned her Billionaire's crushed obstacles, and James Hall wasn't a man to be trifled with. But Sofia wasn't driven by recklessness. She was driven by truth. Every lead she uncovered painted a picture that unsettled her. Shell companies in Delaware, offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Philanthropic donations were timed suspiciously close to controversial mergers. She could feel it, there was something beneath Hall Group's polished reputation, and she intended to expose it. Still, she couldn't ignore the contradiction gnawing at her, the man she had met at the gallery. For a brief, disarming moment, James had seemed human. Not the untouchable titan she had imagined, but a man who carried silence in his eyes. Sofia shook the thought away. Sympathy was a luxury she couldn't afford. 2 weeks later, her articles had snowballed. What began as a cautious inquiry was now a series syndicated across multiple outlets, shared and debated in boardrooms and coffee shops. Hall Group's PR team scrambled to respond, issuing polished statements about transparency and community commitment. And then came the invitation. A gilded envelope slipped under her apartment door, embossed with the crest of the Whitmore Foundation. Annual Gala for Children's Futures, New York City. At the bottom, a handwritten note. Ms. Carter, your presence is requested. J.H. Sofia read it twice, her pulse quickening. James Hall had drawn her into his arena. The ballroom at the Plaza Hotel shimmered with extravagance. Crystal chandeliers cascaded light across marble floors. Strings played soft sonatas, blending with the hum of laughter and clinking glasses. It was a playground for the elite, a theater where wealth masqueraded as benevolence. Photographers lined the red carpet outside, capturing gowns, tuxedos, diamonds, and carefully curated smiles. And into this world stepped Sofia. She wore a gown of midnight blue, elegant but unpretentious. The cut was simple, the fabric flowing with understated grace. Heads turned not because of ostentation, but because she carried herself with quiet authority, a presence that refused to be overlooked. James saw her the moment she entered. He stood at the far end of the ballroom conversing with senators and CEOs, but his gaze sharpened when it fell on her. She was not out of place. She was a disruption, a spark in a room designed for polished conformity. Their eyes met across the crowd and the world seemed to tilt again. It happened during the charity auction. A painting. Ironically, another abstract storm was unveiled, and the host invited James Hall to speak. James took the podium with practiced ease. His voice was calm, authoritative, painting Hall Group as a paragon of philanthropy. He spoke of scholarships, hospitals, community centers, each phrase calculated, each pause deliberate. Applause followed, polite and admiring. Cameras flashed. And then, from the audience, a voice cut through. Mr. Hall, Sofia said, rising from her seat. The ballroom fell into a hush. Heads swiveled. Photographers angled their lenses. James's jaw tightened, but he masked it with a faint smile. Ms. Carter, he said smoothly. How unexpected. Sofia's voice carried clearly, steadily, and sharply. You speak of philanthropy, yet your company's recent acquisitions have displaced hundreds in the Midwest. You promise transparency, yet entire subsidiaries are buried offshore. Tell me, Mr. Hall, how do you reconcile these contradictions? Gasps rippled through the room. James's expression didn't falter, but his knuckles whitened on the podium. He had faced hostile investors, ruthless rivals, but never a woman who stared straight through him with such conviction. For a moment, silence stretched heavy and electric. Then James leaned forward slightly, his tone smooth but edged. Philanthropy is not a contradiction, Ms. Carter. It is balance. We create, we expand, and yes, sometimes change is disruptive. But Hall Group builds futures. Your articles could be more credible if they sought the whole picture rather than fragments. The audience murmured, divided between admiration and unease. Sofia did not flinch. And perhaps your future is not as untouchable as you believe. The words landed like a gauntlet thrown. Flashbulbs exploded. Social media feeds lit up within minutes. Billionaire confronted at gala. When the crowd dispersed into whispers and the music resumed awkwardly, James descended the stage. He found Sofia near the bar, calm, as though she hadn't just shaken the room. "You're playing with fire," he said quietly, his tone low enough for her ears alone. Sofia sipped her wine, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Then maybe it's time someone burned the illusions down." James felt an unfamiliar rush, anger, yes, but threaded with admiration, even desire. This woman was infuriating and unforgettable. As the night ended, James stood alone on the hotel balcony, the New York skyline glittering beyond. The echo of Sofia's challenge lingered sharper than the city's neon lights. He should have been furious. He should have been planning her downfall. And yet, he could not shake the certainty that Sofia Carter had become more than an adversary. She was a storm, and storms once begun could not be contained. The city that never slept had finally quieted its chaos, dimmed into the low hum of taxis and distant sirens. Midnight draped New York in a veil of shadows, the silence that invited secrets to surface. Sofia Carter had just returned from the gala, her pulse still unsteady from the confrontation that set social media ablaze. She sat at the desk in her hotel room overlooking Central Park, her laptop open, a blank document staring back. Usually after such an adrenaline-fueled night, words would normally pour out of her. But tonight her thoughts tangled, unsettled by more than the story. By James Hall. His calm rebuttal at the podium replayed in her mind, not as deflection, but as something else. Something that hinted at a man carrying more than polished lies. She hated that the image of him lingered, that her curiosity edged into something personal. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Sharp, controlled, her breath caught. Few people knew where she was staying. She rose, cautiously peered through the peephole. It was him, James Hall. Dressed in a dark overcoat, his expression unreadable under the dim corridor light. Sofia's instinct screamed to shut the door to protect herself from the predator she had publicly challenged. But another part of her, the journalist who lived for truth, knew she couldn't turn him away. Not now. She opened the door. "What do you want?" His voice was low, steady. 5 minutes. That's all." Against her better judgment, she stepped aside. James entered with the presence of someone who always carried the weight of a room. Yet here in her modest hotel suite, he seemed oddly displaced, like a lion confined to a cage too small. He didn't sit. Neither did she. They stood across from each other, silence thick between them. "You shouldn't have confronted me like that," James began. His tone was sharp, but beneath it lay something less specific. "You mean I shouldn't have exposed you?" Sofia countered, arms crossed. A faint smile tugged at his lips. "You didn't expose me. You exposed yourself." Her brows furrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" James stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "Do you think writing articles makes you untouchable? Does standing in a ballroom with cameras protect you? You're playing with forces you don't understand, Sofia. The sound of her name on his lips unsettled her. Too intimate, too personal. She straightened, refusing to let him see the flicker of unease. Enlighten me then. What forces am I playing with? For the first time that evening, his composure cracked. He exhaled, turned toward the window, the city's glittering skyline casting fractured light across his face. There are shareholders in my company, James said slowly, who aren't investors in the conventional sense. They're power brokers, men who don't appear on paper, but control decisions from the shadows. They've built networks that span continents, governments, and industries, and they don't like attention. Sofia's heart thudded, but she masked it with skepticism. Convenient story. Billionaire blames faceless villains instead of taking responsibility. He turned back, eyes flashing. Would I come here in the middle of the night to spin a story? The intensity in his voice silenced her retort. For a long moment, Sofia studied him. The James Hall she had painted in her articles was cold, ruthless, untouchable. But standing here stripped of the armor of reputation, he looked human. There was tension in his shoulders, yes, but also fatigue. A man accustomed to control is now forced to reveal vulnerability. Why are you telling me this? She asked softly. James hesitated. His jaw clenched, then relaxed. Because you're already in it. The moment you started digging, they noticed. And they don't forgive curiosity. The warning sent a chill through her. She wanted to dismiss it as manipulation, another tactic to silence her. But the sincerity in his tone was harder to ignore than she expected. She forced a laugh, brittle. So now you're my protector. His eyes held hers. No, I'm the reason you're in danger. The words landed heavy, unshakable. Sofia turned away, pacing to steady herself. You expect me to believe that a man who controls billions is actually a puppet? Are you James Hall? Just another player. I expect you to believe what you see, he replied quietly. Haven't you noticed? Did I create the offshore accounts and the subsidiaries? They were there long before I took over. I've been trying to untangle their web for years. Her mind spun. The puzzle pieces she had uncovered suddenly looked different when rearranged under this light. Still, doubt clung stubbornly. Or you're trying to pull me into your narrative, make me hesitate, so I stopped digging. James moved closer, so close, she could feel the quiet gravity of his presence. If I wanted you, silenced Sofia, I wouldn't be here talking. You'd already be gone. Her breath caught. Not from fear, but from the conviction in his voice, the way his words vibrated with unspoken truth. The silence stretched heavy with conflicting emotions. Sofia's instincts told her to push him away, to hold the line between journalist and subject, truth and manipulation. But her heart, the part she guarded most fiercely, whispered that James Hall was not the monster she had painted. And that realization scared her more than any shadowy shareholder ever could. Finally, she asked almost reluctantly, Why me? Why tell me all this? His expression slightly softened. Because you're the only one bold enough to confront me, and the only one who might actually listen. The admission left her shaken. Vulnerability wasn't supposed to belong to men like him. James glanced at his watch, then back at her. I shouldn't stay. They'll be watching me and watching you. He stepped toward the door, then paused. His hand lingered on the handle as though wrestling with unspoken words. At last he turned back. Be careful, Sofia. Curiosity is lethal in their world. And then he was gone, leaving the room colder, emptier, charged with the weight of everything he hadn't said. When the door clicked shut, Sofia pressed her hands to her temples, her mind a storm. She wanted to dismiss it, to cling to the clarity of her role, journalist versus billionaire. But his words clawed at her. They noticed. They don't forgive curiosity. She felt the edges of fear for the first time, not just for her career, but for her life. And yet beneath the fear was something more dangerous, the stirring of trust. James Hall, the man she had sought to expose, might not be her enemy after all. But if he wasn't the villain, then who was? Sofia stared at the city lights beyond her window, her reflection faint against the glass. In her chest, conviction and confusion warred, tangled with something she refused to name. For she knew this was no longer just about a story. It was about survival, and perhaps fate. The flight to Chicago was unplanned, a decision Sofia made in the middle of the night, after staring too long at documents that refused to fit into neat patterns. Her articles had stirred a storm, but the puzzle remained incomplete. The numbers didn't add up. Offshore accounts traced back not to James directly, but to a subsidiary run by Richard Miller, a polished executive often seen at James's side. Miller was the kind of figure most journalists overlooked, his name buried in press releases, beneath the shadow of Hall Group's empire. But Sofia's instincts screamed that he was the thread to pull. By the time she landed, the air in Chicago carried the sharp bite of late autumn. She wrapped her coat tighter around her and hailed a cab to the outskirts, following an address whispered through a reluctant source. A warehouse. Of course. The place loomed at the edge of an industrial strip, its windows dark, its brick walls weathered by years of silence. To anyone else, it was nothing but another forgotten building. To Sofia, it pulsed with secrets. Inside, the air smelled of dust and machine oil. Her flashlight cut across rows of crates stacked like silent sentinels. She kept her camera close, her notebook ready. Her breath fogged in the cold. Every sound, the creak of a board, the drip of water, echoed too loudly. She found the filing cabinets tucked in a corner as if discarded. Inside, the records weren't just sloppy, they were damning. Wire transfers, falsified invoices, and donations were redirected to shell companies. And every trail led not to James, but to Richard Miller. Her pulse quickened. This was it, the proof she needed. She snapped photos, flipping through papers, her hands trembling not from cold, but from the weight she held. This could shift the entire narrative. James Hall wasn't the orchestrator of corruption wolves surrounded him. The thought unsettled her. Because if James wasn't the villain, then what was he? The creak behind her was too deliberate to be the building settling. Sofia froze, her hand tightening on the flashlight. Another sound, footsteps, slow, steady, approaching. She turned the beam, slicing through darkness, and caught the glint of metal. A man stepped forward, his face half hidden beneath a hood. In his hand, a crowbar gleamed. "You shouldn't be here," he growled. Her pulse spiked. She backed toward the exit, but another figure appeared, blocking the way. Panic clawed at her, but she forced her voice steady. "I'm just looking for records. Nothing that concerns you." The first man smirked, lifting the crowbar. "That's the problem. It concerns me too much." They advanced. Sofia's options narrowed. She could scream, run, fight, but none promised survival. Her mind flashed with James's warning. They noticed. They don't forgive curiosity. She raised her flashlight like a weapon, but the warehouse doors burst open before the blow could fall. The sound of footsteps thundered across the concrete, authoritative, unyielding. "Please, step away from her." James Hall. He strode into the shadows with the force of inevitability, his overcoat flaring, his gaze sharp as steel. Behind him, two of his security men fanned out, weapons drawn. The attackers faltered. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then the first man swung his crowbar, reckless, desperate. James moved faster than Sofia expected. For a man of his stature, intercepting and driving his fist into the attacker's jaw with controlled precision. The crowbar clattered to the floor. The second assailant bolted, only to be caught by James's men. And just like that, the danger broke. The warehouse echoed with the ragged sound of Sofia's breath. James turned to her, his chest rising and falling, his eyes burning between anger and concern. "Are you insane?" Sofia bristled even as relief flooded her. "I didn't ask you to follow me. You didn't have to." His tone was sharp, but beneath it unmistakable fear. "Do you have any idea how close you came? I found proof." She cut in, lifting the papers, her voice trembling with adrenaline. "It's not you. It's Miller. He's the one laundering money through subsidiaries. He's the rot inside your company." James's expression shifted hard edges, softening into grim realization. He took the files from her and scanned them. The lines around his mouth tightened. "Damn it." He looked at her again, this time with something like reluctant respect. "You were right." The words disarmed her more than his fists disarmed the attacker. She had braced for denial, deflection, but not acknowledgement. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with something unspoken. Finally, James said, "From now on, you don't investigate alone. If Miller realizes what you have, he won't stop with scare tactics." Sofia lifted her chin, unwilling to be cowed. "I don't need a bodyguard." His gaze held hers unflinching. "You need an ally, whether you want one or not." The defiance in her chest tangled with reluctant gratitude. She hated the thought of depending on him, but tonight had proven the truth. James Hall wasn't the danger she had imagined. He had saved her life. And worse, her heart betrayed her with a flicker of warmth at the sight of him standing there, protective, furious, alive. The night air cut sharply and cold as they left the warehouse together. James walked beside her, his silence heavier than words. For the first time, Sofia wondered what it must feel like for him, leading an empire riddled with corruption, mistrusted by the world, yet fighting forces no one else could see. For a fleeting moment, she almost reached out. Almost. But then she remembered trust was dangerous, especially with a man like James Hall. And yet, as their footsteps echoed through the Chicago night, Sofia couldn't shake the truth. This was no longer just her fight. It was theirs. The partnership was never meant to be easy. From the start, Sofia told herself she was working with James Hall only because necessity demanded it. The files from Chicago had forced them into an uneasy alliance, she with her relentless pursuit of truth, he with the resources and power to withstand the storm bearing down on them both. Yet as days turned into weeks, Sofia found herself in spaces she had never imagined. Hall Group's private offices, black cars with tinted windows, late-night strategy sessions where coffee turned cold between them. And in those quiet hours, she saw cracks in James's armor. He carried silence like a second skin. Surrounded by advisors, executives, and security, James always projected control. But when the boardroom emptied, and only she remained, his gaze drifted to windows that looked out over the city. His expression haunted. Once during a long night in his penthouse study, Sofia caught him staring at a framed photograph on his desk. A woman with auburn hair was smiling, her hand resting on the shoulder of a younger James, his late wife. Sofia said nothing, though questions burned on her tongue. Instead, she watched as he set the frame face down, as if unable to bear the weight of the image. At that moment, she glimpsed not the billionaire titan, but a man hollowed by loss. And it stirred something in her she didn't want to name. Their exchanges softened, though neither admitted it aloud. James, who once spoke to her in sharp edges, now listened. He asked for her perspective on strategies, allowed her to challenge him without bristling. Sofia in turn began to see beyond headlines. She saw the precision in his mind, the discipline in his choices, and unexpectedly, the quiet respect he extended toward her convictions. One evening when fatigue lined his features, she teased, "For a man who claims to control empires, you don't sleep much." He smirked faintly. "Empires don't rest. Neither do ghosts." The words lingered heavy and unguarded. Sofia felt her heart twist. The storm arrived on a Friday night, the tempest that bent trees and turned Manhattan streets into rivers. Rain lashed against the glass walls of James's penthouse, thunder rumbling like a warning from the heavens. They had spent hours poring over documents tracing Miller's hidden networks, and the tension between them wound tight with exhaustion. Something shifted when the storm knocked out the lights, plunging the room into darkness, save for flickering candles. Sofia stood by the window, the city a blur of rain. James approached his presence unmistakable, even in the dim glow. "You should get some rest," he said softly. "I could say the same to you." Her voice was steadier than she felt. For a long moment, neither moved. The air was thick with unspoken words, the storm outside echoing the storm within. Then, as if drawn by gravity, James reached out. His fingers brushed her cheek, tentative, as though testing the fragility of the moment. Sofia's breath caught. She should have stepped back and reminded herself of all the reasons this was reckless. But instead, she leaned into the warmth of his touch. Their lips met. It wasn't a kiss born of calculation or conquest, but of vulnerability, a surrender neither had planned. Rain pounded against the glass, lightning split the sky, and for that brief eternity, Sofia felt the world dissolve into the press of his mouth, the steady strength of his hands, the ache of loneliness breaking open into something fierce and fragile. When they finally pulled apart, their foreheads rested together, breaths mingling in the silence between thunderclaps. "I shouldn't," James whispered. "Neither should I," Sofia replied. But neither moved away. Later that night, when James stepped out to take a call, Sofia wandered the study restless. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil inside her. She was drawn to the locked cabinet in the corner, which James always kept closed. For reasons she couldn't name, she tried the handle. To her surprise, it wasn't locked. Inside were folders, photographs, and documents tied not to Miller, but to James's wife. Medical records, insurance papers, notes from private investigators. Her pulse quickened as she scanned the files. The story of his wife's death, long believed to be a tragic accident, was not so simple. There were inconsistencies. Payments are made quietly. Investigations halted abruptly. James had been hiding this. The realization struck like a shard of glass. The man who had warned her of shadows, who had just kissed her with raw honesty, was still keeping secrets about the one chapter of his life she most needed to understand. When James returned, she snapped the cabinet shut, her face composed, but her heart splintered. He looked at her, something tender in his gaze. "Are you all right?" Sofia forced a smile. "Of course." But inside, the fracture widened. That night, lying awake in the guest room, James had insisted she take. Sofia stared at the ceiling as the storm raged on. Her lips still tingled from his kiss. Her body still remembered the way he had held her. And yet the image of those documents burned hotter, the secrets, the omissions, the truths he hadn't trusted her with. For the first time, Sofia realized she was caught in a battle against corruption, and within herself, between the journalist who craved truth and the woman whose heart had betrayed her. She wanted to believe in him. But how could she, when even love came cloaked in lies? The days after the storm carried a fragile silence like glass balanced on the edge of breaking. Sofia and James continued their reluctant partnership, sifting through documents, interviewing sources, tracing the threads of Richard Miller's corruption. Outwardly, they worked in tandem. Inwardly, Sofia's thoughts were a battlefield. Every time her eyes lingered on James, she remembered the night of rain, the warmth of his lips, the vulnerability in his touch. But just as vivid was the image of the hidden cabinet, the files he had never meant for her to see. Secrets. Always secrets. She told herself to wait and press forward with the investigation. But doubt gnawed at her resolve like rot at the foundation of a house. The tip came on a Tuesday afternoon, disguised as an anonymous email. Sofia almost deleted it, assuming it was just another crank message from someone trying to ride the publicity of her articles. But the subject line froze her breath. "You're looking at the wrong man. Start with his wife." Her pulse quickened as she read further. Attached was a single audio file, grainy but clear enough, a hushed conversation between two men she didn't recognize. Hall knew. He was there the night she died. "Don't let anyone tell you different." Sofia's stomach twisted. The message was unsigned, but the implication was unmistakable. James. For weeks, she had struggled to reconcile the contradictions, his warnings, vulnerability, silence about his wife. And now here it was, the possibility that James Hall hadn't been victimized by tragedy, but complicit in it. Her chest tightened with something between grief and fury. That evening, she found him in his penthouse study, surrounded by files and half-finished glasses of scotch. The city lights burned bright behind him, but his face was shadowed, drawn. "James," she said, her voice tight. He looked up, weary, and for a moment his expression softened at the sight of her. "Sofia, you look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have." The words cut sharper than she intended. She tossed her phone onto the desk, the audio file cued and ready. He pressed play. James's jaw clenched as the whispers filled the room and his eyes darkened. When it ended, Sofia crossed her arms, her voice trembling with rage. "Tell me it's not true. Tell me you weren't involved in her death." James rose slowly, as if the question's weight pressed against his very bones. "It's not what you think. That's not an answer." His eyes pleaded with hers, but words failed him. "I can't explain. Not yet." The silence that followed was unbearable. Sofia's chest heaved, anger spilling through the cracks of the tenderness she had begun to feel. "You kissed me," she whispered, voice breaking. "You let me believe there was something real between us all, while hiding this." James stepped forward, desperation in every line of his. "I didn't hide it to deceive you. I hid it to protect you." She recoiled as though struck. "Protect me, or protect yourself." The storm that had begun in her chest finally erupted. "I trusted you," Sofia cried, her voice raw. "I defended you against my own instincts, against my own story. And now, I don't even know who you are." James's hand reached toward her, but she stepped back. His voice was ragged, stripped of the billionaire's polish. "Sofia, please. If you walk away now, you're walking straight into their trap." She shook her head, tears burning at the corners of her eyes. "No, James. The trap was letting myself believe you." And with that, she turned, her footsteps echoing like thunder as she stormed out the door, slamming behind her. James stood frozen, her absence crashing down around him like shattered glass. He wanted to run after her, to drag her back and explain everything, the truth about his wife's death, the shadowy forces that had haunted him ever since. But the words locked in his throat, sealed by promises and dangers he couldn't yet reveal. Instead, he sank into the leather chair, burying his face in his hands. For the first time in years, James Hall, man of empires, master of control, felt utterly powerless. The woman who had ignited something in him, something long buried, now saw him not as an ally, but as a monster. And he had no one to blame but himself. Miles away, in an office cloaked in darkness, Richard Miller poured himself a glass of whiskey. Security footage played on the screen before him. Sofia leaving James's building, her face streaked with anger and betrayal. Miller smirked, the glow of satisfaction lighting his features. "Perfect," he murmured. "Divide and conquer." He leaned back in his chair, savoring the moment. For months, he had worked to tighten the noose, planting whispers, feeding doubts, twisting truths until they became weapons. And now the bond between James and Sofia was splintering exactly as he intended. "Let them destroy each other," Miller said softly to no one. "And when the dust settles, Hall Group will be mine." The darkness seemed to applaud his words, the city's nightlights flickering like a silent chorus to his triumph. Back in her hotel room, Sofia collapsed onto the bed, her chest aching as though her heart had been torn in two. She replayed James's face in her mind, the anguish in his eyes, the desperation in his voice. If he were guilty, why hadn't he denied it outright? Why had he looked so broken? But doubt screamed louder than hope. She had built her life on exposing lies, on refusing to let emotion blind her to truth. And yet, when it came to James, her heart had betrayed her. With the tip burning in her mind and James's silence echoing in her ears, Sofia vowed she would uncover the truth herself, even if it meant standing against him. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the city eerily quiet. But in that silence, danger rippled unseen. James sat alone in his penthouse, staring at the photo of his wife, grief and guilt carving deep lines into his face. Sofia sat alone in her hotel, fists clenched around her notebook, anger and longing warring inside her. And somewhere in the shadows, Richard Miller smiled. For he knew the most dangerous weapon wasn't bullets or money. It was betrayal. The anger that had carried Sofia out of James's penthouse should have hardened into resolve. Instead, it festered into something more fragile, more dangerous: doubt. She replayed his silence, the torment in his eyes, when she demanded the truth. A guilty man would have denied everything. James had not. He had begged for her trust without words he could not speak. Still, the whispers of betrayal echoed louder. And so Sofia did what she had always done when her heart faltered. She returned to the facts. For days, Sofia operated secretly, cutting off contact with James, ignoring his calls and working through sources she had cultivated over the years. Her search led her deeper into the financial labyrinth surrounding Hall Group. And the deeper she dug, the clearer the name became: Richard Miller, the vice president of Hall Group. James's right hand, the man always at his side during public appearances. The one executives whispered about with a mixture of respect and fear. Miller's fingerprints were everywhere. It was his signature on questionable contracts. His shell companies are buried inside acquisitions. His name, hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy, is attached to offshore accounts, siphoning millions. And most damning, Sofia uncovered internal memos, suggesting Miller had orchestrated a smear campaign within the board itself, leaking just enough to make James look complicit. Her breath caught when she read the final line of one memo: Hall's reputation must collapse before the takeover begins. Meanwhile, the media storm raged. Headlines screamed accusations of embezzlement and fraud. Board members distanced themselves from James. Investors demanded answers. For the first time in his career, James Hall's empire trembled. He faced cameras with stoic defiance, but the cracks were visible, sharper lines at the corners of his eyes, tension in his jaw, the clipped tone of a man battling not just enemies, but ghosts. To the world, it looked like the fall of a billionaire. To Sofia, watching from the sidelines, it looked like the perfect trap snapping shut. Her investigation peaked on a rain-soaked evening in Washington, D.C., inside the hushed halls of a law firm known for protecting the powerful. A young associate, nervous but sympathetic, slid a folder across the table. "If they know I gave this to you," he whispered, his hands trembling, "I'll make sure they don't." Sofia promised. Inside were emails, dozens of them. Miller's correspondence with shadowy partners, detailing payments to silence investigators, instructions to frame James, and even discussions about the night of James's wife's death. The pieces clicked together with brutal clarity. Miller had been bleeding the company dry, and woven a narrative designed to destroy James and seize control. Sofia's chest tightened. She had been wrong. Terribly, dangerously wrong. Back in her hotel, Sofia stared at her laptop screen that night. Her article draft glowed in the dim room, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. She had two paths. She could publish the story as it stood, detailing James's silence, the suspicions, the files she had uncovered. It would finish him. The world would believe he was guilty, and she would be praised for her bravery. Or she could dig deeper, risk everything, and expose the truth about Richard Miller. But that meant aligning herself with James, the man she had accused, the man who had kissed her, the man who still held secrets about his wife's death. Her heart waged war with her conscience. He lied to me, but he also saved me. He's guilty of something, but not this. The storm inside her raged until her hands trembled above the keys. Sofia stood outside Hall Group's headquarters the following day, watching reporters swarm the glass doors like vultures. Cameras flashed as James strode past them, his expression a mask of stone, his silence feeding the frenzy. For a moment, her chest ached with the memory of his touch, the way his voice had cracked when he said, "If you walk away now, you're walking straight into their trap." And she realized he had been right. Richard Miller wanted her to destroy James. She was the weapon. If she published, she wouldn't just end James Hall, she would hand Miller everything. Sofia drew in a trembling breath. The choice was no longer about headlines. It was about truth. That evening, she followed a lead to a private club in downtown Manhattan. Crystal chandeliers glowed above marble floors, but the opulence sharpened the rot beneath. Through a crack in the door, she saw Richard Miller laughing with other men in tailored suits, raising glasses of whiskey as if celebrating. Her recorder captured every word. "Hall's finished. By the time the board votes, his reputation will be in ashes. And with him gone, we take control, permanently." Her hands shook as she pressed stop. She had the proof. Richard Miller was the enemy. Later, alone in her room, Sofia spread the evidence across her desk. Miller's memos, his emails, the recording from the club. She stared at them, her heart racing. This was it, the truth she had been chasing for months. But the truth was not straightforward. To publish against Miller meant aligning with James, trusting him, despite his silence about his wife. To publish against James meant betraying her instincts, her heart, and the man she now knew was not the villain. The weight of choice pressed down until tears blurred her vision. Love and justice, trust and betrayal, survival and sacrifice. For Sofia Carter, the line between them had never been thinner. Richard Miller lit a cigar in the darkness of his office, unaware that the noose was tightening around his neck. Soon he murmured to himself, a smile curling on his lips. "Hall will fall, and everything will be mine." But in another corner of the city, Sofia closed her laptop with trembling hands, her decision not yet spoken aloud, but heavy in her chest. She would not let lies dictate her story. And she felt the flicker of clarity for the first time in weeks. The enemy had a name: Richard Miller. The choice weighed on Sofia like a stone. But when dawn broke over Manhattan and light spilled through her hotel window, she knew. She could no longer deny the truth. Her instincts screamed. James Hall was not her enemy. Richard Miller was. That morning she called him. Her voice was steady, but beneath it ran the current of everything unspoken. "James, we need to meet." The silence on the other end lasted just long enough to sting. Then his reply came, rough, cautious. Where? They met in a quiet cafe on the Upper West Side, far removed from boardrooms and penthouses. James wore no suit, no mask of corporate armor, just a dark sweater. His hair mussed, his eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. The air thickened with tension. when Sofia slid into the booth across from him. "I have proof," she said, sliding a folder across the table. "Emails recordings. It's Miller. He's been orchestrating everything your downfall. The financial scandals. Even the whispers about your wife." James's hands hovered over the folder before he opened it. As his eyes moved across the pages, the muscles in his jaw flexed. When he finally looked up, no mask was left, just raw, burning fury. James muttered almost to himself, "He's been at my side for 10 years. And all this time, James." Sofia's voice softened, drawing him back. "This isn't just about betrayal. It's about survival. We need to bring him down together." The word "together" hung between them like a fragile promise. He only stared at her for a long moment, as though weighing whether he could let himself trust again. Then slowly he nodded. Together. They spent hours in that cafe, huddled close, sketching strategies on napkins and whispering over cooling cups of coffee. Their goal was clear: gather undeniable evidence of Miller's corruption enough to force the board, the press, and the law to turn against him. It wouldn't be easy. Miller was careful, ruthless, and surrounded by men loyal to his money. But Sofia's sources and James's access made a dangerous combination, dangerous enough to threaten everything Miller had built. As the afternoon waned, Sofia caught herself studying James, the sharp lines of his face, the exhaustion etched into his features. He was a man carrying an empire on his back. Yet in this moment, bent over napkins beside her, he looked almost ordinary, human. And she realized with a pang that she trusted him now, not just with the story, but with her life. The trail led them west to Los Angeles, where one of Miller's shell companies was quietly laundering money through real estate deals. James arranged for them to stay in a discreet hotel near downtown. Sofia spent her nights chasing leads, slipping into archives, meeting informants in shadowed corners. Ever the strategist, James kept close his presence, both protective and suffocating in equal measure. It was on their third night that the danger finally caught up. They had just left a warehouse near the port, Sofia clutching a USB drive packed with files copied from Miller's hidden accounts. The air smelled of salt and gasoline fog rolling in from the ocean. James's car idled near the curb, a sleek black sedan blending into the night. But as they approached, headlights flared behind them. Two SUVs roared to life, engines snarling like predators. "Run!" James barked, his hand gripping Sofia's arm. The street erupted in chaos. Tires screeched, engines thundered. Sofia's breath tore through her lungs as James pulled her down an alley, the roar of pursuit closing in. Bullets sparked against brick walls. Sofia gasped, stumbling, but James yanked her forward, his grip unyielding. "Keep moving," he shouted. They burst onto another street, James shoving her into the car. He slid behind the wheel, slammed the accelerator, and the sedan shot forward, weaving through traffic. The SUVs followed, their headlights blazing in the rearview mirror. Sofia clutched the dashboard, her heart hammering. "They're gaining." "Not for long." James's voice was calm, but his knuckles were white on the wheel. He swerved hard, the car skidding onto a side street, the city a blur of neon and concrete. The SUVs followed, relentless. The chase tore through downtown, horns blaring, as James threaded impossibly tight turns, his precision terrifying and flawless. Sofia's nails dug into the seat as she tried to steady her breathing. "You've done this before," she gasped. His jaw tightened too many times. A truck blocked the street ahead. James spun the wheel tires, screaming, the car sliding sideways into another alley. Sparks flew as the sedan scraped a dumpster, but they shot out the other side, still moving. The SUVs split, one circling, one tailing. "They won't stop," Sofia whispered. James glanced at her just for a second, his eyes fierce. "Neither will I." Something in his tone, unshakable and raw, steadied her pulse even as fear clawed at her chest. At last, after what felt like an eternity, James cut the headlights and swerved into an underground parking structure. The sedan screeched to a halt, hidden in shadows. They sat in silence, breaths ragged, the echo of pursuit fading above them. Sofia turned to him, her hands trembling. "They would have killed us." His eyes found hers, burning with intensity. "Yes. And I can't let that happen. Not to you." She froze, her chest tightening. "James." He leaned closer, his voice low, urgent, stripped of every barrier. "I've lost too much already. I won't lose you. Do you understand? Whatever happens, I'll protect you. With everything I have. With everything I am." The world seemed to still. The storm of engines, bullets, and fear dissolved, leaving only the space between them charged and fragile. Sofia's heart thudded painfully. She wanted to resist, to remind herself of all the reasons she shouldn't believe him. But the truth was undeniable. James Hall had risked everything to keep her alive. And in his eyes, she saw not the billionaire untouchable, but a man desperate, fierce, and terrifyingly sincere. Her voice trembled. "James." For a moment she thought he might kiss her again. But instead, he reached for her hand, his grip steady, grounding. "You're not alone in this anymore," he whispered. "Not while I'm breathing." Above them the city pulsed with danger. Richard Miller's men still hunted. The war was far from over. But in the dim silence of the parking garage, two enemies, turned allies, sat side by side, their hands entwined, their hearts unsteady but united. For the first time, Sofia felt not just fear but hope. And James Hall, who had lived years shrouded in grief and power, finally allowed himself the promise of something he thought forever: lost love worth protecting. The marble columns of the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., gleamed beneath the autumn sun, their solemn weight a reminder that justice, however slow, eventually demanded its stage. Inside, the air was charged with anticipation. The gallery overflowed with reporters, flashing cameras, and murmuring spectators. It wasn't just a trial, but a spectacle, a reckoning. At the center sat Richard Miller, his tailored suit pristine, his silver hair slicked back, his expression calm, to the point of arrogance. He looked more like a man preparing for a business negotiation than one facing decades in prison. Beside him, his high-priced attorneys radiated confidence. Money bought the best, and Richard had never lacked for money. Across the aisle, James Hall sat with his legal team, his posture steady, but his eyes shadowed. For months, his name had been dragged through the mud, his reputation shredded. Today was his chance at redemption or ruin. And in the second row, clutching her notebook, but carrying something far heavier, Sofia Carter prepared for the moment that would change everything. The trial began with Richard's defense painting him as the victim of corporate politics. His attorney spoke in smooth tones, gesturing to Richard with practiced sincerity. "Mr. Miller has dedicated decades to building opportunities, creating jobs, and serving communities. These allegations are unfounded and result from jealousy, vendettas, and misinterpretations by individuals seeking to profit from scandal." Richard nodded along, his expression measured, almost sympathetic. To the casual observer, he could have been a misunderstood statesman. But Sofia knew better. Every memo, email, and recording she carried in her bag told the truth of his ambition, manipulation, and crimes. Still, doubt gnawed at her. Would it be enough? Could truth really pierce the armor of money and power? When it was time for the prosecution, the atmosphere shifted. Evidence was laid out, including financial records, wire transfers, and testimonies from whistleblowers. Piece by piece, the web tightened. Yet Richard remained unshaken. At one point, he leaned back, smirking faintly, as if he already knew the outcome. Because money could bend laws, influence could sway judges. And Richard Miller had both. Until Sofia stood. Her heart thundered as she rose from her seat, clutching the small recorder in her pocket, since that night in Manhattan. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear, "I have additional evidence." The courtroom hushed. The judge raised an eyebrow. "And you are Sofia Carter, investigative journalist. I possess a recording of Mr. Miller admitting his intent to frame James Hall and seize control of Hall Group." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Richard's composure faltered for the first time, his smirk twitching into a grimace. The judge gestured. "Play it." The audio filled the room. Richard's voice unmistakable. "Hall's finished. By the time the board votes, his reputation will be in ashes. And with him gone, everything will be mine." The words echoed like a hammer striking glass, shattering the illusion of innocence Richard had so carefully crafted. Reporters scrambled pens, scratching furiously, cameras clicking. James closed his eyes, relief flickering across his face, the weight of months finally lifting. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the judge pounding his gavel for silence. Richard surged to his feet, his mask-gone fury blazing. "This is illegal. Stolen evidence lies." But the damage was done. The truth had been spoken, and no amount of money could unring the bell. By the end of the day, the verdict was clear. Richard Miller was guilty. As marshals placed handcuffs around his wrists, Richard glared across the courtroom at James, his voice a venomous hiss. "This isn't over." James met his gaze unflinching. "Yes, Richard, it is." The gallery erupted in cheers, the reporters racing to file headlines. "Hall vindicated, Miller exposed in courtroom bombshell." For James, it wasn't just victory, it was resurrection. His name, dragged through the mire, was finally clean. And it was because of Sofia. That evening, as the courthouse emptied and night fell over the city, Sofia stepped into the cool air, her chest tight with relief. For the first time in months, the path ahead seemed clear, until the gunfire shattered the night. Men in black masks emerged from the shadows, weapons raised. Chaos erupted as people screamed and scattered. Sofia froze her body, locking in terror until James was there pulling her down, shielding her with his body, as bullets ricocheted off marble steps. "Go!" he shouted, his voice hoarse with urgency. But she couldn't move. Not when he was in front of her, taking the brunt of danger meant for her. One of the gunmen aimed directly at her chest. James lunged, wrapping his arms around her, twisting so his body bore the shot instead. The sound cracked through the air, deafening. James staggered, pain flashing across his face, but he didn't let go. He dragged her behind a column, his breath ragged blood staining his shirt. "James," Sofia cried, panic rising like a tide. He gritted his teeth, forcing a smile even as the color drained from him. "I told you. I'd protect you." Security rushed in, shots were fired, and the assailants were tackled. The chaos ended as abruptly as it began, the attackers subdued. But James lay slumped against the cold marble, his hand clutching the wound, his breathing shallow. Sofia knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face, her hands trembling as she tried to staunch the bleeding. "Stay with me," she begged. "You can't leave me now, not after everything." His eyes found hers, soft, despite the pain. "Sofia, I thought I was cursed to lose everyone I loved. But then you proved me wrong." Her heart shattered. "Don't you dare say goodbye." Sirens wailed in the distance. Paramedics were coming. But in that fragile space between life and death, between love and loss, Sofia pressed her forehead to his. "You're not allowed to leave me, James Hall. Not now. Not ever." As James was lifted onto a stretcher, his hand still gripping hers, Sofia felt the enormity of what had almost been taken from her. the man she had once sworn to expose, had become the man she could not bear to lose. And though Richard Miller was gone, and justice had been served, the battle for their future had only begun. Their bond had been forged unbreakably in the crucible of danger and love. And Sofia knew, with unshakable certainty, she would fight for him as fiercely as he had fought for her. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor filled the hospital room, a fragile but undeniable proof of life. For days, Sofia had sat by James's bedside, refusing to leave her fingers laced through his, as though the sheer force of her touch could anchor him to this world. He had been shot because of her. The thought haunted her every time she closed her eyes. Yet when she looked at him pale but alive, his chest rising with each labored breath, gratitude drowned out guilt. "Come back to me, James," she whispered one evening, her head bowed against his hand. "Not as the billionaire. Not as the man the world argues about. Come back as you, the man who fought for me when no one else would." As if her words reached through the fog of pain, his eyelids fluttered. Slowly, with effort, James opened his eyes. He only stared at her for a moment, confusion and exhaustion clouding his gaze. Then a faint smile tugged at his lips. "You didn't leave," he rasped. Sofia choked back a laugh, sob pressing a kiss to his knuckles. "Of course I didn't leave. Would you let me get rid of you that easily?" He tried to chuckle, but it came out as a wince. "I should have known. You never do what anyone expects." Her eyes filled with tears, but were not from sorrow this time. "Get used to it, Hall, because I'm not going anywhere." The days that followed were slow tender. Sofia read aloud from newspapers, ignoring the headlines praising her bravery and focusing on lighter stories that made him smile. She fussed over his meals, argued with doctors on his behalf, and fell asleep more than once, with her head on his chest, lulled by the reassurance of his heartbeat. One night, as the sun set in amber streaks across the window, James reached for her hand with surprising strength. "Sofia." His voice was low, deliberate. She turned to him, her heart already racing. "Yes. I spent so long building walls thinking they would protect me. Power, money, control. I thought if I had enough, I'd never have to feel this kind of pain again." His thumb brushed over her fingers. "But then you walked into my life and tore it all apart. You made me feel again. You made me want again." Tears slipped down her cheeks unchecked. "James." He cupped her face gently, his touch reverent, fragile. "I love you, Sofia Carter. I always did from the first moment you looked at me like you saw the man beneath the mask. And if you'll let me, I'll spend the rest of my life proving it." Her sob broke into laughter as she leaned forward, kissing him deeply, pouring every ounce of her own truth into the press of her lips. When they parted, her voice trembled, but was clear. "I love you too, James Hall. God help me, I do." Months later, under a cloudless Miami sky, their love was sealed, not with whispers, but vows. The beach stretched endlessly, waves lapping at the shore like applause. White chairs lined the sand, filled with friends, colleagues, even a few family members who had once doubted them, but could not deny the bond between them. Sofia walked down the aisle barefoot, her gown flowing like ocean foam, her curls catching the sunlight like a crown. James waited at the altar in a simple linen suit, no longer the billionaire behind glass walls, but a man reborn, smiling, as though the world had bent to this moment. When she reached him, he whispered so only she could hear, "You're even more beautiful than the first time I saw you. And you're still too stubborn for your own good," she teased, her eyes shimmering. The officiant spoke, but it was their vows that silenced the crowd. "I promise to protect you not with walls, but with honesty. James said, his voice unsteady with emotion. To fight for you with you, even when the world stands against us. You are my truth. Sofia, my home. Her voice trembled as she replied, I promise to challenge you, to remind you of who you are beneath the empire. Stand beside you when storms rise, and love you when the world forgets your worth. You are my choice, James. Always. The ocean roared as if to bless them when they kissed, and the guests rose in thunderous applause. During their honeymoon, Sofia revealed the secret she had been holding close. One evening, as they walked hand in hand along the beach, the sun dipping into the horizon, she stopped and turned to him, her eyes glowing with both nerves and joy. James, she whispered, placing his hand against her stomach. We're not going to be just two anymore. He blinked, confusion giving way to stunned realization. You mean? She nodded, tears spilling freely now. Twins. James Hall. The man who had faced down enemies and empires laughed with unrestrained joy for the first time in years. He lifted her into his arms, spinning her around as the waves crashed at their feet. Twins, he repeated, wonder in his voice. Life is finally giving me back what it took. Sofia pressed her forehead to his. Not giving back, and giving us a new beginning. Months later, as the Miami sun rose over their seaside home, James stood barefoot in the sand. Sofia at his side, her belly round with promise. Their fingers entwined as they watched the waves, their future stretching like the horizon. Behind them, laughter echoed the sound of family friends and a world that had finally shifted from chaos to peace. James bent to kiss Sofia's temple, his voice a vow to her and the life they had created. No more shadows, only light, always. And together with hope in their hearts and love unshakable between them, James Hall, Sofia Carter, and their growing family stepped forward into a future as vast and boundless as the sea. If you've followed this journey from the beginning, let this ending remind you. Love is worth fighting for. Truth is worth risking for, and even in the darkest battles, light can be found. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because every story deserves to be heard, and every ending deserves to shine.